Hi, everyone. My name is Elisa Forneray, and I am a content marketing writer at Culture Amp. I want to take the time just to welcome both Alicia and Didier to this conversation today as part of our Heart of the C-Suite series. Thank you both so much for being here for this today, and I'm really grateful for you taking the time and bringing some energy into this room.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for context, we started the 7-part multimedia journey a couple of weeks ago called Working Through It. And the purpose of the content that we're creating through this campaign is to create content that will provide support, insight, personal stories, and advice related to this period of transition and unrest in the workplace and socially and culturally. The reason that I suggested that we have this conversation today and get the three of us in this room together was to be able to use some of the practices that we're talking about in that journey to model vulnerability and active listening around one of the most prevalent issues in our workplace that we're facing right now, which is how systemic racism impacts every employee at work, particularly in tech and in the United States. So before we jump into this conversation, I just wanted to make a few asks and suggest a few guidelines. Didier and I were talking about this yesterday, and I said to create a safe space, I think that there needs to be some intention to how we structure this container. So my first request is that we recognize and respect that we're doing this across racial divides and with power dynamics in the room. I am an employee of Didier. Alicia, you're coming from outside of our organization and lending us your voice and your energy right now. We are Black and mixed women and people of color working in this space. And Didier, you're here as a white male CEO in a room with 2 Black women. So I just wanted to make space for that and recognize it and sort of honor that and hold that intention. My second request is that, thank you. My second request is that we practice active listening, and really that practice is focused on requiring each of us to listen and fully concentrate on what the other person is saying, understand, clarify, and respond, and then remember what each other is saying and carry that through the conversation. So I think to me that will create a sense of respect and a practice of being present right here, right now, just for the next 30 minutes as we do this. And lastly, we talked about this a little bit beforehand, and my final ask is that we're okay being challenged. It sounds like all 3 of us are 100% on board with that. So those are my asks, and I just want to invite both of you to accept them or challenge me on any of them so that we can start the conversation.
Here for it.
Okay.
Looking forward to it and gratefully accepted.
Good, thank you. So I wanted to start the conversation today having each of you reflect on notes that you published publicly recently. And I'm sort of just going to leave it to you to explain, what your piece was about, and then similarly, what it was like to draft and publicly publish those pieces. And then while you're explaining that, also just give an introduction of the context of where you come from in writing that piece and who you are, and introduce yourself a little bit. And so, Alicia, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah. So I'm Alicia. I work as an inclusion and diversity manager for a technology services company. I've been in the technology arena now for about 5 years. Prior to that, I worked at a multicultural advertising agency. And at my university, I had a lot of work in the diversity and inclusion space, serving as a director of diversity for our student government. My background, though, I'd say has always been around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it just was a matter of time before I was able to marry that into my working life, my professional life. I'm a mixed gal, half Mexican, half Black. My mom was born in Mexico and immigrated to the United States at a young age. She then went on and found a one-way bus ticket to Iowa to basically start a new chapter, and met my biological dad, who's Black, and then married who I consider my dad, who's a white man. And then they go on to have my brother 4 years later, who's gay. So there we are, just like this multicultural, mixed race, family in small rural America, Iowa, with more cows than people and one stoplight. And my whole life was consistently driven by meeting people where they're at and understanding where they're at to engage in conversations that would hopefully lead to some sense of understanding. And so fast forwarding to now in the tech sector, as it relates to me putting these thoughts out through Medium, these were not thoughts that I just had. I've had these for a very long time. I've spoken and have been a part of various panels and technology meetups and workshops. I actually founded what is now the largest Women in Tech Denver meetup here in Colorado. And I've had conversations based on this a handful of times, but the compelling feeling that I had after Tuesday, May 26th, when I woke up and heard about George Floyd and what had happened with Christian Cooper, just brought me to a sense of just, I guess you would say Twitter fingers, but through a Google Doc of just typing it out. I don't identify as a writer, and Elise and I were talking about this. That's why I feel so grateful that her and I connected, because that is her professional role. So for me to just spend less than 3 hours typing through and drafting this direct call to action that I had for the majority of the representation in technology, i.e. white males, it just came out like a water fountain. I can't even describe it. Soon after, I sent it out to a couple.
Oops.
And then ran off to the mountains to camp with some of my core best friends and not have service for 2 days. So I didn't know if I was going to be met with getting fired. I didn't know if I was going to get met with a bunch of backlash. I wasn't sure what the response was going to be, but my heart felt so open after doing that and just speaking my truth that, though it's still hard to describe and processing it now, I just knew it was the right choice.
That's incredible. I think, especially from a piece that we published earlier this week that I wrote, my heart felt like it was going to explode. And the idea of not being able to respond or, have people evaluate or respond to you at all sounds like a blessing and a curse. So I really appreciate that. One of the questions that, I have, and then we'll have Didier talk about his own note, is we were talking about this yesterday. Were there any moments where you felt that you needed to take a pause, or where you sort of pulled back and you thought, I need to rewrite this section. I maybe need to not publish this. Maybe this isn't right for the world in this format. I'm curious.
No. And that's what's funny about this, to be honest with you, because I didn't do this with the thought of, this might be my chance to get discovered, or this might be my call to action. Like, I just put it all out there and then maybe backtrack, which probably lesson learned moving forward. I guess like the average Medium article that has the best response is like 7 minutes. I have an 11-minute article of me just this is what I've witnessed as a female of color in the tech sector. These are just my thoughts. And again, I simply want this to be the goal of having this be a launching pad for further dialogue. And even where we're at today, I think is a great residual impact of what that article did. And that was the whole intent behind it. And I think for the sake of brand, I'm at a point now in maybe my understanding of where I might tie into this whole battle of diversity, equity, inclusion. If I have to be someone's scapegoat to say, hey, look what somebody else posted about this as it relates to the tech sector, cool to do that.
Thank you for being that person. I really appreciate that. So then Didier, I'd love to hear about your piece that we posted a couple of weeks ago publicly, that was an open letter to the Black community and our Black campers, and just to similarly hear a little bit about your background, have you introduce yourself, and then talk about that process of getting it, from your brain to the conversations to post it online.
Excellent. And maybe if I can just quickly reflect, what I love just hearing in that story, Alicia, is that's the startup world in a nutshell. This idea of just seeing something that you feel you have to do and going and doing it. And then people come and say, but how did you do that? Or how did you pull off? And you're like, I was too naive to know that I couldn't. So I just did. And I think it's just awesome to hear, like, because I think sometimes people see these things and think that they only come through years and years and years. And oftentimes it's not the people that were entitled to it that do it. It's just the people that care more, the people that go, enough, I can't stand this anymore. If nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to do it. And so I think it's great to hear that background story. It sort of really brings it to life. In terms of what we wrote, so we wrote a blog post, a sort of open blog post on behalf of the company, to the Black community. We're with you. And it was written from myself and my two co-founders, Rod and Doug. And the first thing that I would reflect on, and I guess we wrote that as part of a response to what we saw happening in the world around us. And very much the mission of Culture Amp is to create a better world of work. And one of our sort of realizations and recognitions is that if we think about this whole concept of like anti-racism as a macro concept, this is really about trying to create a better world. And you can't have a better world of work if you don't have a better world. And so it sort of came from that place. But in terms of thinking about writing it, the first thing is who it came from and who it was written by is always a really interesting conversation. So one of my learnings as a CEO is that, I'm asked to comment on lots of things. I'm asked to put out statements on lots of things. And I have opinions on lots of things, and I'm happy to talk about lots of things, but I'm very much careful, thoughtful, I don't know what the right word is, in terms of what morals am I reflecting when I present on behalf of the company? Are they mine? Are they what I perceive to be the companies as a whole? Like, how do I navigate that? Because there's 400 odd people at Culture Amp that all have different beliefs and different feelings. And how do we represent that to the world in an effective way? And so this statement and this blog post that we wrote was not me going off into a corner and saying, this is what I think about this issue. Not least of which, who am I necessarily to tell the people or tell the world what to do about this issue? This was actually brought together by a range of people inside Culture Amp, pulling together going, what could and should be our stance on this? And what is something that we want to say to the world? And then it was something that the three of us as co-founders were very happy to put our name to. And one of the internal questions as we were preparing it, and I was talking to Aubrey, who's our, I always trip over the preferred title that she has, head of it's equitable design and impact, because she doesn't like the DEI title. She likes equitable design and impact. So one of the things I asked her is, who do you want this letter to be from? Do you want this letter to be from me? Do you want this letter to be from the company as a whole? Do you want it to be from our camp color? Like, what's going to help this message work? And I think for me, that was probably one of the realizations, is that one of the most important roles that I can play is to create space and amplify other people's voices. And sometimes that's to put my name on it, and sometimes that's to put their name on it. And that's actually an ongoing thing that I think we're going to keep exploring in terms of which ways can we do this. And if I reflect on my journey to here, we started Culture Amp. There was 4 of us that started Culture Amp as 4 white 30-something IT male brunettes. So like zero visible diversity in any way you can imagine. And so the whole journey of the company has been becoming a more diverse company as we go along. And gender was obviously one of the first ones that you really start to grapple with. And then you start to explore that there's more and more, and there's no finish line on this. The inverted commas better you get, the more diverse you get, the more inclusive you get, the more you realize how much there is still to do. But I have to admit, probably the hardest one, and the one that I've felt the least comfortable providing an opinion on, is race. And partly because I'm coming from Australia, where I think our understanding of race is essentially unconsciously incompetent. So there's the learning model of unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, conscious competence, and then unconscious competence. And if I was to be bold and characterize the US and Australia, I would say Australia is unconsciously incompetent, whereas it feels like the US is consciously incompetent. At least it's talked about. At least it's out there. And so that's very confronting, coming from Australia, coming over, going, oh, wow, I'm not used to this. I'm not used to seeing this. Don't know how to engage in it. With a second layer of who am I as an Australian to, criticize somebody's laws or tell people how to do this. Now, of course, I'll form my opinion, and I often do, on various presidents and things and the stupid things they do. But it's still a very confronting thing. And to actually have to understand somebody else's history and all of the norms and all of those sorts of things. But we are a global company, and half of my company is outside of Australia. And I'm here for Alicia. I'm here for everybody to try and create the world that they want to have. And one of my reflections through this whole process is it feels like right now, this is an opportunity for us to make change. And that change can then be springboarded into other change. And you look back to like the apartheid era, yes, that was a local change, but that had global ramifications. And that opened up other things that were then possible. So right now, this feels like a place that I need to be and can be for our people, for our company, and for the world. And that sounds way too grandiose for me to say it that way, but it's a reason not to turn away. It's a reason not to say that's not my fight.
So, Alicia, my plan was to have the two of you reflect on each other's notes and what it was like to read them. But I'm curious, I want to open the floor to you. I would love to hear what you have to say about Didier's intention, the note itself, anything that he just said. I just sort of want to give you space to respond to that.
Yeah, I think to start, it's more of a question around this, because I've been met with this a lot in response to my article from other white male tech leaders. It's just the maybe overwhelming feeling that the onus is on you to eradicate some of these systems of inequity that our technology sector has been built on. How does that feel and land for you as a leader as you take on some of the direction and some of the strategy to move forward?
I think it's right. I mean, I saw a tweet the other day, and I think I've used Twitter more in the last week than I have in the entire year prior. Like it's kind of crazy. And I saw a woman did this tweet where she said, if you're the benefit of white privilege or compound privilege in its general terms, you don't choose to have that. You can't choose to have it or not. You have it. And that system is there propping you up every day. And you can choose to acknowledge it or not. And I think one of the most validating things that I did 2 or 3 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, we had an event in New York, Culture First by Design event. And it was the first time that I got up and basically talked about compound privilege. And all I did was basically say, hey, I want to acknowledge that me being up here as the CEO of a tech company, hopefully I'm good. I'm here because I'm good at what I do. But I have to recognize that there are many other people that could be in my shoes but aren't, because they were not given the opportunities I was given every step of the way. And so the first thing I have to do is acknowledge that privilege. And there was a journalist that I was talking to who said to me once, the hallmark of privilege is that you can't see it when you have it. And so my first step in trying to change that is to at least acknowledge it. So I think you making that call is both right and necessary, because until we as the tech industry, until we as people who have been the beneficiaries of compound privilege all the way, recognize that fact, nothing's going to change. And then the necessary next step is that we do what we can to unwind that privilege and to help give people a hand up who haven't got it, to try and make that less so going into the future.
And I think that's the connection point that I really appreciate you calling out, that I think is still missed with some industry leaders right now, is that, yes, to your point, that it's right that it's on you to do some of the legwork to remove some of these hurdles that have been in our way that just continue to fuel the inequity. But once those barriers are removed, you too need to get out of the way, and then, or to how you phrased it, reach back and help pull people up to be in spaces, because that's an example where I'm starting to see a little bit of some confusion, I would say, especially within the tech sector, right? And that was partially where my head was going upon. And after reading your article was, love this as a first step to creating some more parity. Like, hey, we recognize from maybe a mental health standpoint, our Black employees might need specific action right now. That is one that you called out. Love that. Moving forward, it's okay, how do we continue to advance? So what does our leadership succession planning look like? What does our attraction strategy look like of underrepresented talent? Furthermore, what's our retention strategy look like for this talent? How are we ensuring that we're not only, it's in parallel, they're at the same time type of thing. Remove some of these barriers, get out of the way, help rise up. So the next time you're at a conference per se, it is somebody that looks like me or has historically been untapped that's also delivering great content.
I agree. And I think that's the kind of uncomfortable truth of it too, which this is on gender lines, but the same issue, which was, I can't remember if it was this year or last year, but they did, I think it was Comparably did this, top 50 CEOs as measured by women in their company. And I was one of the people on that list in the US. And so I'm like, hey, great. I'm really glad that, that way. But the bad thing was there was only 3 women on that list of 50. So until that changes, well, great. It's nice to have these men that women are happy to work with, but like we actually have to get to the end goal where you want that list to be roughly even. And so one of my realizations on that was that I can be both the problem and a solution to the problem. And both are true. That just because I am trying to do good work, just because I'm trying to pull people up, I'm still the problem. The fact that you've got a straight white middle guy, although I have to say, I always hate it when people go straight guy or get like, who's anyone to know what you choose to do outside those areas? But still, it's true. Like by me being in this role, I'm an example that the problem still exists, but that doesn't mean that I can't do something about it. And that's really something that I take on board. And I think if we're going to do the real work, we also then have to accept that we have to plant seeds for trees that we won't get to sit under. So, yes, I can go hire a successful Black executive onto my leadership team, and that will improve the here and now dynamics for the company, and it will give people to look up to. But then we're all competing for the same small pool of talent. Like really what we have to be doing is bringing people in, training them, growing them, promoting them, creating leadership pools. Those people may go to be successful leaders at other companies. And that's actually better for the world than us all fighting over getting this one person to be on our executive team.
Yeah.
So that's also a challenge, that this is a long-term problem, not a short-term problem.
Absolutely. And, just even hearing that, it brings up thoughts maybe more at the philosophical level that you mentioned you studied in your undergrad. So I'd be curious to gauge some of this too. It's just around that abundance mindset or this feast or famine mindset or the haves and the have nots. Like I am genuinely curious. How do you not low-key feel a little threatened that people are now realizing that, hey, we're at a tipping point now where we're saying we don't necessarily want a homogenous group occupying these spaces. In fact, we see so much research that proves that that's actually not good for any organization. So how does it truly, as you as a white male technology leader, not feel a little threatened at the same time?
I guess I don't feel threatened because I've already been given more than my share. Like the fact that I'm sitting here as a CEO means I've already taken more than what most people will get. So I think that question of fear and threat is hugely real, but it's probably more so for the people coming after. I was the beneficiary of all this privilege when I came through 20 years ago. And it's the people that are coming through now that might be feeling, hey, wait a second, the game's no longer stacked for me. I'm going to have to fight for stuff I didn't used to have to fight for. And I may unfairly, lose that. And that's true. I mean, the pendulum's going to have to swing the other way. And there's going to be damage the other way before it can come back into some equilibrium. And I think that's going to be a challenge. And you're seeing that play out once again, gender and race and in different ways where you're seeing boards. There are probably now people that would be good members of boards that aren't getting those positions because they're men. Like I know people that I would potentially hire, but I'm like, wait a second, I don't need to add another person just like that to my exec team or to my board. And so, yeah, it's going to affect them. But we're talking about, compared to the opportunity and the need for change on the other side at a macro level, it's a necessary change. And so I think it's easy for me to say I'm not threatened by it, but that's because I don't have as much to lose, if I'm totally honest at this point. My job is to try and dismantle what got me here, which is actually, once again, a very privileged thing to be able to do.
Sure. I like a lot of the conversation at the macro level, because I think there is a very, very necessary tie-in for us to draw lines to what we're doing into our organizations. But I've spent a lot of time recently, candidly, trying to uncover why I was feeling so overwhelmed these last couple of weeks throughout all of this, aside from everybody now wanting to talk to Alicia Jessup, the Inclusion and Diversity Manager. It's been absurd. But I think it's in part because everyone is doing this at a macro level and talking about it at a macro level, and then trying to figure out where their fit is and trying to boil this ocean. And while I can appreciate that, because I think it begs bigger conversation, like I'm saying, maybe at a philosophical level, a morality standpoint, a political, a social, however you want to define it. But I think the best way for us to really make substantial change, I would say, is at a systems level, within systems thinking, meaning, hey, within that, where do I fit in as it relates to a particular system? Maybe it's my organization, perhaps, because that's oftentimes where I'm uniting through the lens of a lot of my conversation. And within that system, in a system, where can I start to operate to really start getting the cogs in these wheels to have some harmony and some drive in the direction that we deem appropriate as an organization? Has Culture Amp taken on an approach similar to that, or how does that look like, maybe from your equity department to other lines of business? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, that I 100% agree with you that ultimately it's not the people themselves that create these outcomes, it's the systems that these people exist within. And I think going back, and I remember reading Peter Senger's The Fifth Discipline, he talks a lot about systems thinking. I don't know if you've read it. And one of the key takeaways from it is that the way you create interactions between people can explain most of the variance in how people respond, not the people themselves. So we often look at a situation and go, that person is this or that. And you're like, well, actually, you can put almost anyone in that situation with those modes of interaction, and they will act that way, because it's the nature of the way the system's been constructed. And we have to change the system if we want to change the behavior. And so that is something that I know Aubrey is very, very, very focused on. And I think a lot of the good people in this space are too, because it's such exhausting work trying to fix every single case that you come into terms with. And you still do, because there's that compassion. But you know that the change is only going to come by being able to step back and change the system. I think one of the things that I was reflecting on in the article that you wrote that really struck home for me, and there's two. One which I've heard before, but it's really great to have it validated, which is this idea of it's okay to make mistakes. It's better that you try and do it wrong than that you don't try at all. Because I think that's very much the thing that white leaders need to hear, which is most people aren't going to judge you if you say the wrong thing, as long as you're willing to stand up, as long as you're willing to be out there and actually be involved in it. But probably the most powerful one was actually the thing that you said at the end of the article. So I'm going to pull it up and read it just so that I get your wording right and I don't mess it up, which is I see no color is not the goal. I see your color and I honor you. I value your input. I will be educated about your lived experiences. I will work against the racism that harms you. You are beautiful. Tell me how to do better. And I think that I will be educated about your lived experiences. That for me was really powerful. This idea that the goal here is not to say we have a system that has no bias. We've removed all of that. The goal here is to say, I'm going to learn how to treasure and value somebody that I haven't got the lived experience to fully understand yet. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to do that work. And I want to do that work. And I want to bring these people in to be successful and effective in different ways than different people. And I think that's challenging and difficult, but also really a wonderful concept and something that I want to aspire to try and do more of. And certainly at Culture Amp, some of the most powerful things we've done internally, so I think it was a year or a year and a half ago, Stephen Huang, who was our head of D&I at the time, he arranged a session of listening sessions with our camp color. And the way he set it up is he said they could choose which executives came in the room or which senior people in the company were in the room. So they drew up a list of people that they wanted to have listen. And then they were just able to tell their story. And there was no right of reply. It was just tell the story. And so I was thankfully one of the people that got to be in the room and listen to the stories. And just to hear firsthand these stories about their lived experience was really affecting for me, particularly because some of those people were people I knew quite well. Like they'd been in the company for a long time. I consider them friends. We've spent time together, but I didn't know some of those things about their life. I had no idea about that part of the lived experience. And to hear them express it so powerfully, it was really moving. And one of the things that I took away from it was, because I have a background in film, how tiring it is having to wear a mask all the time, and how easy it is to forget that we require everybody else to put a mask on when they come into our world. And so part of my takeaway and part of the conversation I was having afterwards is like, how can I put on a mask? Like, how can I shoulder some of that burden and change the way I choose to be to try and meet you halfway? Like what you said right at the beginning, which is how do we meet people where they are so that we can go on this journey together, rather than saying, okay, here's where I am, you have to come to me. Mm-hmm. And so that was, it's not systemic, but it opened me up to the systemic.
Definitely. No, definitely. And I love that, right? And that tweet that I quoted at the end by Carlos Rodriguez, that struck home for me so much so, because that is the goal, the piece of honoring. And I was having a conversation with one of our Canadian leaders yesterday, and a point that he drew for me also really resonated with me. And it's along the lines of what Carlos was saying and what you were even saying about what struck home from you in those moments of just sheer storytelling is, I think a problem that we're also going to have to make as a mindset shift as a society is we pride ourselves in the United States as being a melting pot of a country, right? Where we can bring people together. But the undertone of melting pot is inevitably assimilating to some degree, right? Like you're putting it all together. I love the thought when he said, we try to pride ourselves here in Canada, and I don't know if this is true or not because your girl's never been to Canada, but I liked it nonetheless, was that they pride themselves on being a cultural messiah. And I think that's the mindset shift. We have to be really diligent in moving forward, is especially when we're going to really highlight these tremendous strategies of attracting and retaining untapped talent is, hey, I want to retain you, but not so then you come in and assimilate and wear the same mask that we all have on. It's no, wear what you deem allows you to be your authentic, most powerful, empowered self, and come on in and share some of those stories about why you chose or what got you to be where you're at today. Like that's where the real beauty and diversity lies. And I think sometimes we get that confused with come on in, but also assimilate. And we have a 9-to-5 and no, you can't work from home. And it's going to be really hard if you have kids and you have to pick them up at a certain time. And ooh, why don't you have a video on your Zoom? Like we start putting in all these things that just innately negate what the whole purpose of diversity is in our workspaces.
I think just hearing you say that too, I never actually thought of it this way, but this idea of meeting but honoring what is, and my mind immediately went to language, that, you know, it's a wonderful thing to learn someone else's language and to be able to speak to each other in two languages and not force one person to have to speak the other language entirely. And I'm actually, unfortunately, largely monolingual. I can little bit of smattering different languages. My wife is an opera singer, among other things. And so she's reasonably good in quite a few languages. And I think the thing that's so interesting is that speaking a different language than your own actually changes your mental models, and you think differently in different languages. And I know people that I talk to, I don't know if you can speak more than one language, that speak multiple languages will say, I like to think in this language for this type of problem because it's a better way of doing it. And I love that idea that that's what we want in our companies too. We want to treasure that we can speak multiple languages, not force everybody into the one language, but we still have to be able to speak to each other.
Yeah.
And it's, I think I often reflect on how amazing, and obviously there was a lot of horrible things that happened at these times too, but when different cultures met and traded with each other, even though they had no common language, they found a common language and they found a way to work together. These things, like this challenge is as old as humankind. I would hope that we've made some progress on that front, though, as a globe.
Yeah. I think the United States will be a very curious case study, I guess, if you will, in how we make that progress, right? With more and more babies being born as multiracial, multi-ethnic, what have you. I think that'll just be something to watch and stay tuned in nonetheless. But I still think no matter what, the diversity of thought, the diversity of perspective, background, upbringing, what have you, will play such a key critical role in how our organizations move forward.
Yeah, and I think at this time, one of the challenging things for us to continue to focus on is a lot of challenges come from fear, and fear comes from the unknown. And I think we can deal with the unknown, but it also comes from insecurity. And so part of the reason it's easy for me to engage in these conversations and want to change the world is because I'm broadly fairly fortunate. You know, I'm not worried about how I'm going to feed my children. I'm not worried about where I'm going to live. I'm not worried about am I going to keep my job. And so we have to pursue those things too. Like we have to find ways to continue to give people that security, to move them up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, so that they can engage with these problems at that level, and they can sit down and see that as part of self-actualization. And I think that's also one of the problems sometimes, that we haven't. People are talking at different levels. And so someone's saying, well, I don't want to deal with this because I have this other problem over here. And I'm actually concerned that trying to solve that is going to affect my ability to solve this. And we've seen that in Australia, like the public dialogue about, you know, inverted commas, boat people and immigration issues. And it's just awful to see that it gets turned into this national security interest thing. And, you know, one of my favorite moments was Bob Hawke, who was one of our previous prime ministers. Somebody asked him about the conversation about boat people, which is this backlash against immigrants coming to Australia on boats. And he looked at the journalist in a very Australian kind of way and just said, we're all bloody boat people. I mean, Australia's whole history, other than the First Nations, is boat people. And so it becomes an issue that we have to solve where it is, and then help people get to the point where they can actually have an actualization conversation, which is what this is. This is about us being human in the fullest form.
Absolutely. And I think there is power still in some people needing to compartmentalize and saying, not necessarily saying like, hey, I can't solve that for fear that it might impact or, you know, indirectly impact whatever else. But the thought, again, if we're thinking about the philosophy of systems thinking or the model systems thinking, I can honor some of that, but I can also be weary of people that want to open it all up and believe in the integration of everything anyway, and then start to get so overwhelmed that they don't know where to start. And that was another piece that I was going to ask you about, because a lot of the responses, I would say, that I've been met with have such a theme of white guilt. And I think that might be in due part to the latter description I had of people trying so hard to tackle this all at once in this system of inequity that they don't know where to start, and then they're plagued by guilt because they don't know where to start. So have you had experiences of white guilt? And if so, how do you work to mitigate that? And then also in turn, spin that into a more productive emotion. I guess, what would you say to maybe somebody who's listening that, you know, aligns to you and is sitting there feeling really guilty?
Yeah, I totally get that. I think I learned so much from my wife on so many of these issues. And we were actually talking about this last night, and we were talking about compassion. And we had an internal thread on a very similar topic to this in my CEO channel. And I shared actually an article of the Dalai Lama's on compassion, because I particularly love his view on it. And the thing that my wife said to me is, at its core, compassion means to suffer together. And so I think the challenge is that when faced with this inequity that you realize that you're in some way, part of, the first thing is that you actually have to allow yourself to realize that the other person is suffering. And then the second thing is you actually have to allow yourself to suffer with them. And that's the bit where I think the guilt comes in, because, and I know for myself, is that one way to not feel so terrible is to somehow construct some cognitive dissonance in your mind so that you're actually not the suffering. Like, well, I'm actually not the bad person here. It was those other people that did that, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But to move forward and to be truly compassionate, you actually do have to suffer with them. And so some of that suffering can be for yourself too, that you're somehow complicit, that you could have made other choices. And one of our executives wrote a post earlier this week, he's in the US, called "I Ain't Done Shit." And it was his own recognition that he considers himself somebody who's always been wanted to be an ally, even though he wouldn't have had that word, considered himself a good person, but still had not taken those extra steps. And he looks back now and he's frustrated with himself for not having done more. And I think allowing yourself to actually sit with that is the first step. That compassion doesn't, in its first instance, doesn't have to mean solving the problem. In fact, it's actually probably better not to try and solve the problem straight away and to just allow yourself to be truly compassionate. And one of my own recognitions at a personal level is it's one of the things I always struggle with when I'm in San Francisco. Coming from Australia, it's quite confronting to walk through the Tenderloin. I've never felt threatened once in San Francisco, but within a couple of days, I stopped seeing the people that I'm walking over or around. I stopped seeing the challenges. And then I catch myself going, the way I'm dealing with this is I'm just shutting myself down so that I'm not observing this person's suffering. I'm not allowing myself to suffer with that person. And I hate that. I find that really, really hard. And it's kind of like a self-defense mechanism. So I don't know if it's advice, but my own reflection is just trying to focus on my capacity to be compassionate, and that compassion is emotionally taxing and so on, but it is also a way of connecting with other people. And at the end of the day, that's one of the most wonderful things. So it hurts, but it also gives so much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What would be your advice to someone on this topic? Because it's not like it flows in all directions. And I'm sure you struggle with the same challenge.
Yeah, I've had a lot of thoughts recently around Black guilt that I think is an area we're not talking about right now, especially, and that stems off the strength of me feeling guilty because I'm not responding or reacting to white guilt. And it's been very teeter-tottery in how I'm like actually feeling about that. Just the wave of, I'll use an example of messages that I've received, and not only through the article, but just in response because of my position as an inclusion diversity manager, both personally and professional lines, people reaching out of, I feel so overwhelmed, I feel so exhausted, I feel so upset, I'm angry, I'm sad, I want to help, what do? I feel so guilty. And I agree with you that actually guilt is a very, very important emotion and arguably should be the first emotion that you experience. I just can't help but start to think it becomes dangerous when people just meddle in it and linger in that guilt, because then it demobilizes them essentially. And so I think a couple of things. For me, it's as simple as, and I put this in the article, when people meet me with the question of, Alicia, ¿qué hago? Like, what do I do? I'm like, well, I don't know, like what you would do to start any other quote project, like learn, be a student of the game. And I think that would be the first piece of advice right now I would offer anybody that is of the majority demographic and has never really sat down to think about how they were going to help have a hand in systemic inequity, is to just learn, unlearn, share, learn, unlearn, share, repeat. It's being a student of the game. And if your starting point is zero, your starting point is zero. There's no shame in that. It's just simply starting. I think another piece to that is being mindful of where you share your feelings of white guilt. What does that do for me? In all sincerity, I appreciate you acknowledging that emotion, but again, to the theme we're talking about, that it can't be the only emotion, I would much rather have a DM, which, by the way, I feel so violating. Unless you're Bad Bunny or Drake, like, I don't want a personal message from you in my Instagram. But if you're going to do it, maybe also emphasize beyond the guilt that you feel. Hey, Alicia, I hope you're doing well. It's 7 a.m. for you on Instagram. I feel so guilty. Saw your article. I can't even imagine how you're feeling. Blah, 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 word salad. But I want you to know this is what it's compelling me to do, or this is what I'm thinking about going. That, to me, is where our heads need to go in this theme of white guilt. And it's hard to acknowledge because everything everyone feels is real. And that comes back to the piece you mentioned about compassion. I don't know if I quite agree yet, and maybe I'm a little jaded, that I need to sit there with you in that, though. I have my own guilt. I have my own feelings. I have my own uncertainty and my own sorrows. I think that's hard for me to even muster up the emotional energy and the capacity right now to sit down with somebody and like feel that with them. I think the third piece I would say to that is maybe be mindful and think about other people you could be reaching out to in community to express your white guilt as white people. I think white people should be sharing their white guilt with other white people. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And actually, reflecting on that, when I was talking about compassion, I didn't mean that the compassion needed to be a shared process. So it wasn't that we need to be compassionate together and you need to be compassionate to my guilt. It was that if I'm feeling guilt, to think about that as a way of lean through that into compassion. So realize that the guilt is a way of making you suffer personally. And so I'm observing your or somebody else's suffering, and my reaction to that is feel guilt, some level of guilt. Okay, now you're beginning to suffer. Lean into that. Suffer with this person. It doesn't mean I have to connect with you on that. It's that's my experience. It's that my thing of starting to explore the compassion. Can I be truly compassionate to you? And to be truly compassionate to you, I have to go through the guilt, because it can't be just about me. It has to be about you. But I need to do that together. And I think another very powerful moment for me was that I went to an inclusion thing here in Australia, and there were two Indigenous women that spoke at the end. And then they were the last people before the break. And so they did a Q&A, and they were asked these questions. And then just before the break, one of the women said, "Oh, can I just say something before we go to the break?" Of course. And so she got up and she said, "Going into the break, I just want to say to all the people out in the room, I am not here to absolve your guilt. I'm sure you are a good person. I do not have the time or the energy to go and absolve you of your guilt." And it was such a well said, and I probably butchered her words, but the concept was there. And it's true. Like, you're not there to absolve me of my guilt. Like, if I read your thing and I start feeling guilty, it's not your job to absolve me of my guilt, even though that might be my reaction to try and make this uncomfortable feeling go away. That's my problem, not your problem. And it's a key that I need to do something, not something that I should go seek to have absolved.
Yeah. And I appreciate that clarification. And I think a couple of things to that. I think I'm also saying, though, that your visceral reaction in that hypothetical, of course, because I know it wasn't, but in that, if that is your visceral reaction to feel personally attacked or feel guilty or feel whatever, I need to honor that. And I will honor that because that's your feeling. But I also think, you said the key word, and what I took away from what you just said is through. We need to lean through that, not just lean in, but let's lean through.
Yeah. And I think it's what I keep coming back to on all these things. It's interesting because I love talking on all sorts of topics, but I would have to say, whenever I'm talking about race, I feel more muddle-headed than I do normally, and I go away often with going, God, that sounded like a mix
what? Muddle-headed?
Muddle-headed, just like I don't have like clarity of thought, and I don't feel like I'm necessarily expressing myself in clear ways. But what I would say on the other side is that in conversations around race, I often feel that we get to connect, and maybe not conversations, more hearing from others about their lived experiences that have manifested this way. You connect with humanity in a deeper way. Like I hear just such raw, visceral stories about the truth of their existence, that it's incredibly powerful. And so that's very inspiring in many ways, because you sit down and go, how can I not honor that truth? How can I not want to respond to it in some way that tries to make that better? If not for that person, then for the world in general.
Mm-hmm. You know, for what it's worth, I too feel muddle-headed in talking about race in America. And I think it's funny because, like I mentioned earlier, I've never felt so needed before up until all of this. And it's been sometimes I get that feeling of imposter syndrome, because I'm like, wow, y'all are really asking a 28-year-old to help unveil our systemic inequities, and not only our organization, but also on a personal lens, because now you're talking to me about something that is really actually irrelevant to our organization, but you've got me on the phone and I want to talk through it with you. But it's fascinating, because really, I think to one point, I think people of color, and really any underrepresented group in the United States, has had more conversations around what makes them continuously underrepresented and probably intentionally underrepresented. But it's often through a lens of survival. Like, I think, with Black men and the unfortunate murder, assassination of George Floyd, I was talking with a girlfriend and she was telling me, like, that is not an unfamiliar table conversation I have with my young Black son around the difference it's going to be for you in America compared to your white classmates. But the tone of it is not like, oh, let's just acknowledge and honor. It's always in this defense and almost maintenance of just survival. And so when now I'm being asked to step that to the side and engage in a very reciprocal, dynamic conversation around how we bring this together to help impact whatever XYZ objective or initiative, it takes a second. And so I share that, like, hey, for what it's worth, I'm still struggling too, because I think in tone with white guilt, sometimes if you've got that shield already of guilt and you're being vulnerable to reach out to a colleague to try to talk about it, and you don't feel like they're meeting you in a certain way, you might feel a little bit more frustrated or might continue to put up the walls. But maybe just take heed that it's going to take a second for that engagement of trust to be established. And that's just bare human connection, right? Mm-hmm. So imagine all I'm describing in the heat of what's happening in our social world, and I've got a white male leader in our organization that I have never talked to before reach out and say, hey, Alicia, I want to make sure I do this right. Can you help? I'm like, yes, because that's the compassion piece, but also low-key struggling to trust you just 100%. And it's going to take a lot of repetition and a lot of sincere repetition for that to get built. And I think that is okay to acknowledge, because we would not ever expect a new client to just open wide arms, like, trust us. That takes a lot of time, and that takes a lot of consistent, disciplined effort to showcase that, hey, I am worthy of your trust in this business transaction.
Hearing you say that, I think it's actually made me reflect on something that might be useful if people are listening to that. So if there is another CEO or leader out there listening to this and trying to process all of this, an analogy you just kicked off for me is, I'm the CEO of Culture Amp. I strive to be very open and very vulnerable, and I reach out to people, and I would like to think that I can talk to anyone in the company and they can come to me with any of their challenges. And we also have a kind of anonymous tool where people can provide questions without who they are, that I try and answer all of them publicly too. And sometimes I get frustrated because the questions that get asked, I'm like, why are you asking this as an anonymous question? This is a conversation we should just be able to have. One of the realizations I have on my better days is, as a CEO, you are two people. You are Didier and you are the CEO. And a lot of the interactions you have with people are not with Didier, they are with the CEO. And it doesn't matter who you are. To your point, it takes a lot for somebody to trust that power balance is not going to be in there against their favor. That there's no trust trust is the residue in promises fulfilled. People have not had promises fulfilled in that interaction before, so why would they trust it? And so I think in that same way, if I take that lens, if I can run that forward, if I'm there seeking to engage with someone else, whether it's across race or gender or whatever, and I'm feeling like they're not meeting me, it's not because they're not meeting Didier, it's they're not meeting me as a white man, or they're not meeting me as whatever else, because there's no trust there. And that trust needs to be built up over time, and it has to be built up through promises fulfilled. And so that's actually a really useful thing for me just to reflect on. And I think by often talking. So thank you for giving me the space to think this stuff through and to give myself a lens that I can use that is actually a comfortable lens, because I've come comfortable with the idea that as a CEO, that's just a role that I feel. It's not the person that I am.
Sure. No, of course. Absolutely. I think that's exactly why we're here together right now. And I think, it also lends into something I've been having a lot of deep personal conversations, both in the working world, but also just off script with some of my girlfriends, that I think it's important to talk about right now, is where some of those feelings of distrust start to go when we witness our organizations take the first steps. This whole theme of, is this genuine? Is this a little performative? Is it going to stop? How do we know? Like, we've been fighting this fight for so long, and now you all want to join in. Okay, great. But now we got to strategize and figure out where your role is. Plus you're asking me what your role should be. It just creates a lot of unnerved feelings. So do you have anything to comment on that after the 6 points you shared publicly about what Culture Amp is going to start doing?
I think there are, in many of these things, something that I often talk about in other ways is this idea that, particularly as a leader, you need to be able to hold the idea of multiple ideas that could both be true but are somewhat conflicting, and not force them to collapse. So it's not that this is true or that's true. They can both be true, or neither can be true, and you kind of keep this in your head. So on one level, like, I know we've had a conversation internally, and I haven't necessarily had this conversation directly, but we've had it, through different people, that there's a valid thing of, and I don't want to speak for other people, but the thing that I hear is like, hey, you should know all this stuff already. Or like, it's nice that you want to learn this stuff, but you should have learned this already. Why haven't you? That's valid. Totally and utterly valid. Equally, from another point of view, I'm like, okay, I'm not even from the US. Like, I don't have that US history and context. We actually probably have more I can guarantee you we studied more US history than you did Australian history, but I'm still having to come up to speed on this stuff. And it's going to take me time. Both of those things can be true without one validating or invalidating the other. And so it's, sort of exploring that piece of, how do we end up in the same place, even if we're going at different speeds and in different directions? And I think when I think about the performative allyship, I had two reflections on it, which some people may piss some people off, but one is that I think one of the challenges we have is, in this world, to try and make sense of it and to be able to make progress of it, there's a lot of elitism in the inclusion world. There's a lot of language, there's a lot of terms, there's a lot of phrases, there's a lot of knowing, winks and so on, which are used to help just deal with just all the crap that you have to deal with, all the emotional labor, all of these sorts of things. But they're also barriers for people actually coming in. So you do see somebody who says, hey, I'm going to try. And then somebody goes, oh, that's performative allyship. What does that mean? And they have to go look it up, and they're like, oh, okay. And elitism in every field is tough, and it's natural, but it's also tough, and it can slow things down. And so I think what's important is that we keep reminding people why these things are important. Like, the challenge of performative allyship, as far as I understand it, and obviously I'm coming from the outer, and I didn't even know what it was 2 weeks ago. So, I'm having to learn quickly. It's a first step. But what I'm hearing, so tell me if this is a valid interpretation, is we love that you're taking the first step. but there's no real credit until the 300th step, because that's where the change happens. And so what we're looking for people is not to do something just today and then forget about it and for it to be, old news. We're looking for people to take a first step, knowing that this is the first step of many, and committing to the fact that this is the first step of many, and realizing that the first things you do are not going to be enough for you to absolve your responsibility in this situation. And I think if we can keep doing that, that's a valuable thing and a really important reminder that we have to commit to this long term. And so now that we're starting to see people making 4-year commitments and those sorts of things is good. Is that a valid interpretation of that concept?
Yeah. And I like, I too align with the thought of you can have multiple thoughts at once and they don't necessarily need to correlate or even agree with another for them to be true. And things don't need to be mutually exclusive, especially in this discussion, especially under this framework of diversity, equity, inclusion, because it's so nuanced and it's such a yarn ball that really there's so many ways and pieces you can be pulling at once. And so when I think about the action companies are taking, I think I can see where some people meet that with a side eye of, is this a performative thing? Are you trying to keep up with your industry peers? Are you trying not to be on the wrong side of the line in this whole fight? And I think those are actually all fair points. And I think back to the theme again of some of this distrust, the way I see it personally speaking is I'm wondering to the comment of, we're not going to celebrate until we're at the 300th step, is because I see the first steps anybody's taking as simply as a warm up. And a lot of these organizations are doing their little half lap of a jog to warm up, and they're already trying to celebrate of like, woo, all right, I did my little half a lap around the track. Like, I feel good. Do you all feel good? Like, let's go take a break. Like, we're ready to relax. No, we've got a whole track meet left to go. Like, what? Take a second. So I see that piece of it where people are like, read the room. And it is a little funny that, are the allies that want to be celebrated for every little thing. And I don't necessarily think it's a thing of wanting to be celebrated. This is such a horrible analogy, but it's like, giving your puppy a treat for everything that they do right. And it's like, that's the acknowledgement. And I think there is a little bit of validation that I'm okay. I have girlfriends that absolutely disagree with me. And I think I'm also in this space for a reason, because I maybe need a little bit more of that leniency and have to take on a little bit more of that compassion. I'm okay to be, here's your kiblet. You're doing good. Keep it going though. We got a long way to go. We keep it moving. And I think that's a piece I'm okay taking. And I know that in itself can be confrontational for others too, because I've had conversations around, I'm not acknowledging anything until I see X, Y, Z. And cool, you're offering call-in Black days. I want to see your executive leadership board. I also can understand some of that too. And I think that's very much that's the direction we're headed, right? That's the direction we're headed. So for those that want to pause and celebrate, yes, recognize the small wins. That's humanity. We need to be doing that for each other. But just as long as we're all on the same page that we are still in the warm up, okay?
Yeah, and actually I would go even further and say I don't think you need to validate it. Like the people that are doing it for the right reasons aren't doing it for validation. They're doing it because they believe it needs to be done. And in many ways, that validation is more harming than it is good. Like, once again, I use gender examples here just because I've spent more time trying to make change in that part of the world. But it's something my wife reflected on, which was we both traveled. And through the period where our kids were young, every time she traveled, someone would say, oh, who's looking after the kids? I didn't get asked once, not once. Mm-hmm. Which just shows the inherent stereotypes in all of these sorts of things. And it's that classic thing that, the man goes home to pick up the kids and everyone's like, woo. It's like, well, no one ever congratulates the woman for doing that. And so I 100% agree that we don't need to validate those first steps for people. As a CEO, I don't need any acknowledgement or any thanks for doing anything that's in the right direction. Thank me in a year or 2 years, or thank me for the executive team 10 years from now, whatever it is. But we don't need the thanks now. The people that have been doing it in the shadows, the people who have been doing this for 10 years, they're the people that need the thanks, because they didn't get it for the last nine years 11 months and however many days. So
Mhm.
I'm fine with that. And then I think it's just what I've seen, I think, is don't let it go the other way where people are actually, somebody does try to help and they're like, that doesn't, not only are they not validating, they're actually kind of kicking them for doing it and saying,
Sure.
don't
Mhm.
even bother
I agree with
until
that.
you're doing the other thing. Because that can get people to retract a little bit. So I think there's a line there where we just need to sit through it and then keep reminding people, yeah, once you step on that track, you can't stop for 42Ks. So
Yeah.
buckle up.
Yeah. And that is a little bit of a concern that I do have working in this space and having worked in this space for years now is inevitably the media will redirect our attention, right? And I think the heightened sensitivity we've all had, I think, could be in due part to that we were all in quarantine. We witnessed this assassination via video. We've got a lot of engagement and a lot of media attention. But if there's one thing I know, the next story is probably building or in the works to grasp our attention. And so I personally have some curiosity around, okay, how do we ensure we're really securing next steps for a foundation to keep this track going and keeping us walking in unison along. So I don't know. I don't know. I have mixed thoughts. I'm hopeful, and I think that's me always being an optimist. But I also think what I'm hoping by these companies that are publicly announcing, though they say, hey, I'm not doing this for performance, but they're still publicly announcing what their actions are. My hope is that because they're publicly doing so, that we're now all getting a peek into each other's homes. And it's like, yo, I noticed that that's still not been cleaned yet. What's up with that? Because we're over here working on our end. What's going on in this neighborhood?
Yeah. And I think Elisa's probably going to try and say at some point we have to stop talking because
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to jump in and say that. I know we're over. And actually, Alicia, that was, what my last question was going to be to both of you, and you just answered it. And it's how do we, if it's not our responsibilities to absolve each other of guilt, if it's not our responsibilities to handhold, what is it that we expect of each other? Like you were saying, Didier, in a year, when do we get the recognition? When is the opportunity for us to say, okay, we're doing something right? But you answered it. Like we, are maybe going to hold our breath for a little while as people of color and women of color in this industry. And I think Didier, you also said it well, that there isn't necessarily anything that people will need to get a pat on the back for ever. And we just need to do it, and we need to do it right, even if it's behind the scenes. So yeah, I want to thank you both. I know we're totally over time, and I'm really grateful. It was just that for me, I was like, oh, this is just so beautiful, and an opportunity that would be missed if, I didn't make space for you to ask questions and answer them. But if there's anything, I will sort of leave it here. But if there's anything, Didier or Alicia, that you feel needs to be said before we can end this, I invite you to that.
I just think this is the key. This is absolutely the critical key that's going to keep us moving, and it's going to keep us challenged, and it's going to keep us honoring and acknowledging different perspectives that we can continue to add into our own individual collective, into our own individual frame that will plug into that mosaic of a greater collective. So really, Elisa, I just want to thank you for putting this and bringing us together. I really, really am grateful for our time.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to both of you for being part of this and setting this up. It's a huge opportunity for me to be able to learn, but also just to engage in this conversation and to be able to think out loud and hear from you and incorporate that into my own learning. And I feel like at the moment, cynical about the short term, but optimistic in the medium to long term. And so, today in one of our channels, somebody shared I think, is it today that's the Loving case celebration, or it's coming up? And let me just go check to make sure that I actually get that right. It is, 53 years. June 12 is Loving Day. So 53 years since they sort of struck that down and actually were able to have, legal interracial couple. And so I bring that up just because there are things now that at the time that were felt like you're just never going to change that have completely changed. Like people, that's not something that people go, oh, how can that happen? And so we can make these changes, and we can change the world so that stuff that just feels so deeply entrenched that you're never going to get rid of it becomes less so. And I'm optimistic about that, and I hope that we can do more of that sooner rather than later. And I hope that I can be, you know, one of the last of this bastion, and one of the first of a new. And I think that's the big thing, that, you know, can we be part of dismantling the system that made us who we are? I think we need to.
Thank you so much. I think, you know, one thing I will say, even though we've all said, you know, tonight that it's not necessarily important to get a pat on the back, but I think one of the things that we're modeling here, and you're modeling here, Didier, is letting me witness some of those promises be fulfilled so that I can build trust in this company and in our leadership. And, you know, like Alicia, you said, it's important for us to have those things modeled and to go through those experiences so that we can build that trust and not have to reach out for things over AMAs, and can just come to our leaders directly and challenge them the way that you did, and in a way that I find really admirable today, Alicia. So I just am grateful for both of you in modeling all of this, and also allowing me to sort of also sit back and listen to this conversation and learn from your wisdom, and build some trust in our company and just the community at large. So thank you. And thank you for going over time. I wish you both a really great weekend, and just look forward to hopefully having more conversations like this through Culture Amp and at Culture Amp in general. As an employee, I think it's incredibly important and valuable.
And Alicia, if there's any way that we can help, you know, I imagine at the moment you're not lacking for opportunity. So, but whatever it is that we can do to help amplify your voice, you know, let us know, because the world needs people like you to help them go on this journey. I would love to do anything we can.
Noted. Thank you for saying that.
All right. I'll let you both get on to finding wine or getting in the car and getting to the mountains or whatever. I'm going to go find coffee, and I look forward to speaking again.
Igual. Adios.
Bye. Thank you.